Opayiinka, right? And then Dr. Goma. Welcome to this session on corporate governance. We are looking at a perspective. Today, I'll be your moderator. I'm John Kofi Annan, founder CEO of Innovative Digital Entrepreneurship Academy. And I have here joining me Professor Opayiinka. I hope I'm right with the name, Prof.
Not quite, Mrs. Opayiinka.
Mrs.
Not quite a
Opayiinka,
professor yet. Working on it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have Dr. Goma.
Not a doctor, too, Mr. Alex Goma.
Oh, Mr. Goma. Okay, thank you so much. This is Corporate Governance Global Summit 2024, and we'll be looking at the perspective of corporate governance globally. We've seen a lot of issues happening with companies, government, organizations in terms of following the practices of corporate governance, in terms of going by the rules and regulations that governs businesses, organizations, government institutions, public organizations, and there are lapses. So on this summit, our major focus is to discuss areas that needs improvement, your perspectives on global corporate governance and what we need to do going forward. I'll be glad to have your perception or perspective on that. So, Mrs. Opayiinka, what do you say about corporate governance globally among businesses, corporations, and government institutions?
Very much for that, John. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tolu Opayiinka. I live in Lagos. First of all, I have to apologize for my raspy voice this morning. I've been struggling with a bit of a cold, but so please, I apologize. I will give a little background about myself. I've been what I would call a financial services operator for close on 30 years in various aspects of financial services, ranging from investment banking, commercial banking, and corporate finance, and finally into microfinance most recently. And that journey has allowed me to watch different corporations, from the big corporations to the very small corporations. And from my perspective, corporate governance is critical to the survival and sustainability of any organization and further of any economy, country, even across countries in the way we relate to ourselves. Now, I think corporate governance is essential because this is a structure that enables accountability, transparency, sustainability, and even succession, which is critical to our existence. Now, to your question, what do I see about corporate governance globally and the trends that we're looking at? I see that the more we know about corporate governance, the more we do not know, if that makes any sense at all. I think that it's like opening different layers upon layers. Even established economies, established countries that we believe have had corporate governance pat down in terms of the structures they've put in place, in terms of the measurements they've put in place, and the legal structures they've put in place, continue to have new challenges. Best example, looking at AI today, how do we deal with that from a corporate governance point of view. So for me, it continues to be an evolving situation. It continues to be a critical situation for survival, and it continues to be something that we have to continually talk about, evaluate, and develop as we go along. That would be my very short answer to your question.
Thank you so much. Mr. Alex Goma?
Yeah, I think if I look at corporate governance and what is happening globally, I think you can situate what is happening in different geographies and probably reference or link it to the level of maturity or development of that particular geography in terms of rule of law. So in clients where you have better structure for rule of law and the application of the principles, they tend to have evolved faster and better when it comes to corporate governance. Despite that, it doesn't mean that there are no huge major lapses. I think so long as private enterprise is driven by sometimes non-altruistic purposes like greed, you're always going to find people who are going to stretch the boundaries to find out what they can get with. So the key challenge that is emerging is whether the people who are regulators actually have the right level of skills, competencies to be able to cope with those extreme cases where people try to game the system. So corporate governance in more developed climes seems to be established, but you have a number of huge, massive failures which tend to raise the question. In sub-Saharan Africa, in Lagos or in Nigeria, where I am, there's still a long way to go because sometimes the regulators, the owners of businesses are cahoots and working together, and therefore it's very difficult for the fundamental principles of corporate governance to apply. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Alex Goma. Bankole is here. Prof, what is your perspective on corporate governance globally? Specifically, let's say the trends happening across the globe, it's in Nigeria and other African countries, businesses across the globe, and the trends of what is happening in terms of corporate governance, in terms of saying that the rules, the regulations of corporate governance is being implemented by organizations across the globe, using Nigeria's case and any other case that you have across the globe. Prof, I think his network is gone. Okay, so Mrs. Opayiinka, you said something concerning AI. What do you think AI is bringing into corporate governance, or what do you think AI is going to take away from corporate governance?
Well, I think that recent occurrences has led us to understand that AI has brought us to understand that corporate governance is not a perfect skill or is not a perfect situation. It continues to evolve. And I'm not sure it will take anything away from it. In fact, I think it might enhance we see, understand, and use or evaluate corporate governance. However, it's also a good example for us to understand that we are never going to get to a place of perfection where corporate governance is concerned. It also opens our eyes to the critical needs, the critical need of corporate governance in our organizations. So if you look at the example that has recently happened, I'm sure we all know the story and all of that. Who is responsible? Who really has the responsibility of delivering on corporate governance rules? And from my perspective, It can't sit at the board alone. It has to go beyond the board. It has to go well across the organization at different levels. Everybody has to buy in and understand the tenets, the principles of corporate governance to make it effective in any organization. So I think what this AI journey has taught us is that cross board. It can't, the responsibility for corporate governance and delivering on corporate governance cannot sit entirely with the board alone. It has to have every other individual in the organization across board for it to be successful. And that speaks also to the succession planning aspect of corporate governance, how corporate governance supports succession planning in the future. I think that it just helps us to understand that, look, we all, it's all our responsibility. It doesn't sit with the board alone. For me, I think that's the critical lesson that I have learned from the whole process that has gone on so far. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Goma, there's something that you made mention of concerning the rule of law regulators on corporate governance. There's a recent case of the EFCC raiding Dangote's headquarters to inquire into practices of the group. The question here is, this shouldn't have come in, but the question here is, who ensures implementation of corporate governance rules? Who also ensures the Corporate Governance Act of Nigeria is being enforced in terms of the regulatory? Which organization? And after that, I'm going to come to Prof. Bankole, whose responsibility is to ensure the enforcement of corporate governance policies and rules in Nigeria. Is it that of Securities and Exchanges Commission? Is it the responsibility of the EFCC? Is it the which organization is to ensure companies, businesses comply with corporate governance rules and regulations in Nigeria?
I think there can't be any one person that is ultimately responsible, because there are different aspects of the code. So I think where EFCC comes in is usually where you have crimes or alleged offenses that are criminal. So financial offenses that are criminal in nature, it should do that. Ideally, you expect that being a quoted company, there's certain aspects of governance that comes from SEC to ensure that the reporting and whatever is being shared to shareholders or the investing public is to make sure that they have the right kind of information to make their choices, and is also to ensure that the company is being run with the right kind of systems and processes to ensure that investors' funds and the stakeholders' funds are not affected. Again, the main issue will come from when you start from the leadership. Leadership is supposed to come from the board. So what's the composition of the board, right? Do you have people on the board who are independent and therefore can say, wait a minute, this is how it is run? Or is this company, since you mentioned Dangote, I'm going to use that as an example. Is this company a one-man run company, or is it a board that takes the decision, right? If it's the board that runs the organization, they have a major responsibility to ensure that everything is being done the right way. SEC has its own responsibility. The Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, which is the body that has set out the corporate code of governance, all right, is meant to be. If you approach corporate governance from an enforcing perspective, not likely going to be successful. You're either going to have to build a network or an entity. Think of the number of firms, right, that exists, and you say you want to try and enforce. I think the best thing is to try and ensure that there's enlightenment and education about which companies are the best run, which therefore helps investment. And also there should be a light shone on the relationship between the regulators and the organizers of these companies themselves. Where you have a relationship that is too close for comfort, then it becomes difficult for the regulator itself to apply the code of governance, where you say, okay, you're making decisions that are ethical or based on arm's length, or where you declare conflict of interest as far as such things are concerned. So different aspects or different organizations within the community will be responsible for certain aspects of driving this code. But at the end of the day, I don't think that enforcement, yes, people that are guilty where the lapses have resulted in crimes should be punished. Therefore, it is the justice system that should take advantage of that. But in terms of setting the regulations to protect investors, I think SEC is responsible for that, and the Financial Reporting Council, which is to ensure that entities within the country operate within a certain code. But even at that, they can't really drive enforcement. They just have to make sure they have a system that shows which companies are properly run so that people can know, right? Rather than try to enforce, be very rigorous in your assessment. So it's very clear to people that, look, yes, Dangote is a big company, but is it well run? No, it is not well run. This is the rating based on what we have. Then it's then left to the investing public to decide whether they want to put their funds behind that company or not. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, then what that means is that, Mrs. Opayiinka, I will need you to add something to that in terms of the case that we are looking at. Who should enforce? Or is it only enforcement, or is it about, as Mr. Ale said, enlightenment? Because there are a lot of companies in Nigeria and across the world who do not even know anything about corporate governance, and they are not implementing any policy on corporate governance. So
thank you. I was quite desperate to join that conversation. I like Alex has broken it down. And from my perspective, I don't think there's a role for the EFCC in corporate governance of an organization. I think there are two different things that we're talking about here. What has happened with the Dangote group of companies, if it's a governance issue, it's certainly not a role for the EFCC, in my view. It's a role for the regulators, where the Dangote industry falls into. Now, is it an enforcement issue or is it an enlightenment issue? There are different aspects. Definitely, there's first of all, an enlightenment issue to deal with. You said there are many organizations, particularly within the small and medium scale industries, that don't have a clear idea of what governance is all about. Definitely, there's an enlightenment issue there. Now, enforcement comes about if there's a crime that has been committed. If there's a crime that has been committed, from the perspective of a lack of a proper governance structure, a good governance structure, then we can talk about how to enforce that. Excuse me once again. So, again, we're looking at, is there a governance structure at all before we move into the aspect of a good governance structure? And if there is a lack of a good governance structure or a governance structure at all, then we can talk about enforcement as opposed to enlightenment. But my thoughts would be that, first of all, you lead with enlightenment. You lead a structure in place in terms of what a company's governance should be about. For instance, in Nigeria, I know that we have governance codes, but I do not think that we have gone far enough in not only establishing those governance codes, but educating the the populace at large about those governance codes. I think a lot more can be done along there. I think we always rely on enforcement when it comes to governance codes in Nigeria. For instance, the regulators will wait for you to fall into an infraction trap and then penalize you most of the time, rather than having constant engagements and resolution meetings, meetings to ensure that you don't even fall into that trap in the first place. I think we wait for something to go wrong and then bring in the sledgehammer rather than support small and medium companies before they become the large companies, support them in understanding what a good governance structure is. And then if there is an infraction, a deliberate or willful infraction, then you can bring in enforcement.
Thank you so much. The issue of corporate governance, is it only applicable to the public sector or only the private sector or all sectors of the economy?
I think it applies to all, because
yes,
I think it applies to all sectors. Because if you go back to the basis of what is corporate governance, it's simply how do you govern an institution or an organization to deliver the results it was set out to do. So be it in the public sector, if you set out a public sector entity, simple example, the Ministry of Education. What is the role of Ministry of Education? To ensure that the citizens are properly educated to become productive citizens in the society, or to create knowledge that allows the society to grow. There has to be certain processes, principles, guidelines that help you deliver that efficiently. So I think when we look at corporate governance as a sidekick, it's one of those things, rather than this is the heart of how you manage a business, or you manage an organization, or you manage a ministry, or any organization. I think it's from that understanding. You want your organization to do well. You want your organization to be sustainable. You want the results to continue year on year on year on. You want to be able to deal with all the challenges that will come. You have to have the right kind of practice. So it applies to all. The way it applies to all will be different, because the measures of success for private is very different for the measures of success for the public sector. But therein again lies some of the challenges, right, that makes corporate governance difficult, because in the private sector, where there's a huge emphasis on profit, sometimes if you don't have the right balance, there's then a question of, I don't care how you get the results, so long as you get the results, and that's where corporate governance gets pushed to the back. So you get short-term results, but you don't build sustainability. So I think it applies to both.
Okay, Prof. Bankole, you are here.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I want to know your perception generally on corporate governance globally, and where we are right now is we are looking at, is corporate governance applicable to only the private sector or the public sector, or both? And if both, the question is that, has the public sector, which is one way or the other the regulator, the governance, or the government of the day, which is one way or the other the regulator, have they met up to corporate governance policies? Have they been able to live up to the regulations, the policies, and what is the private sector learning from them? If so, because we look at a situation where on financial reporting, somebody wakes up and says some money is missing in an office, and it was maybe a monkey or snake that came to swallow the money, and nobody reports where the money went to. And this is happening in the public sector. Now, what do you think the private sector is actually learning from this, in this case, especially in enforcing financial reporting, which falls under corporate governance?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think corporate governance extends to everyone, private sector, public sector, and maybe even faith-based organizations, because it should be aimed at sustenance and continuity and so on. Certainly, many regulators have failed, and like I think it was Tolu saying earlier that some just wait until there are infractions. One of the challenges for regulators that I have identified the fact that most regulators did not go to study regulation, and so they went to university or wherever to do some training, and they now find themselves doing regulations. And even regulatory environment in many parts of Africa evolved at a time when it was government that was in charge of most services, and then it now allowed the private sector to come into banking, into communications, and so on. And so the first set of people doing the regulations did not really learn what should really be done in terms of regulation. And it shouldn't be with a view to killing the people, the sinners, so to say, the people being regulated. Perhaps they don't even have sufficient funding to be able to engage. And so I often counsel that the people who are regulated should also engage the regulators, so that they can learn and also teach and share challenges. Um, but it will also depend on the governments to whether the governments want to encourage the regulators to assist and aid the regulated, or they just feel that no, we are the government, and we are the ones to knock you into doing the correct things, because the culture in many parts of Africa um, is I am in charge. If it's private sector, it's my company. Even if it's a private company before it's now a public company, the idea was I was in charge and I could do and take all decisions. Now it's a public company, and there are demands on me in terms of who I can put on the board, what I can do with the money, and so on and so forth. So it's something which we need to keep on engaging ourselves with, because it's uh, proper corporate governance structures would ensure that shareholders benefit, the directors benefit, everybody, all the stakeholders benefit. So it's I think one or two speakers said earlier on the really understanding the purpose of this, as against, oh, why is it that people just want to interfere with my business or with my organization? I don't want to run it that way. So, and I don't understand or appreciate the purpose of all these regulations. If you don't understand or appreciate, then you probably will not comply, and compliance is important. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mr. Les, we have come into a level where many companies across the globe feel like even government don't have the yardstick to enforce or um, enforce them to comply on corporate governance, because many organizations are doing things that is even out of place. Now, looking at one key area of corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, has organizations been able to live up to that expectation of corporate social responsibility?
I think it depends on the organization. And again, I think if we're looking from a Nigeria or Africa or third world perspective, right? I think part of the mistakes we make is that we assume that the private sector or companies should take the responsibility of the government. So I used to manage companies before, and I always used to tell the stakeholders, why should I build a road when I'm paying my taxes? Now, I understand from a corporate social responsibility that what you're looking for is the social license from the community where you operate. So it's a concept of good neighborliness. You know, if I am a company situated in an environment, I should also support that environment. And a number of firms do that. They might take a proportion of their profits and say, okay, we're going to focus in this particular area. So some focus on education, some focus on art, some focus on sports, some focus on, are they doing enough? Can they do a lot more? Well, there's some that can actually do a lot more. But I think the pressure is coming because we've not asked the basic question, which is the institution that is supposed to provide some of those basic things have not done their job. So rather than us holding them to account, we're now trying to hold the private sector to account. If you go and look at the articles of any company or why the company was set up, it will tell you this is what we're set up to do. They were not set up to build roads. They were not set up to build hospitals. However, I think in recognition of the fact that if we want our stakeholders, if we want our consumers to support us, because some consumers might say, okay, I prefer this company because I see that beyond making money, they're doing something that adds value. So again, that's where corporate governance comes in, because you say, okay, we're adding back, and then it adds back to the bottom line. Because if the society sees that you're doing well for the community, right, there's some consumers that will support you because they feel that, okay, because of what this company is doing, we will support them. But I don't think it's something that is, again, like I say, forced on them. It's common sense. If you do it well and the community likes you, you'll operate. The simple example I give to people is when you look at the question of Shell in Ogoniland, right? They were stopped from operating, and then the government has settled and said, okay, you can go and operate. But if the community doesn't give you the social license to operate, will they protect your assets? Will they allow you to get in there? And so it's taking years. I don't know if they've gone back, but so many years after, yes, they have a license to operate in the community from the government, but they can't operate because they have lost the social license from the community. So it makes business sense for you to do CSR, but it has to be CSR done the right way.
Ms. Opayiinka, your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm nodding because Mr. Alex has raised a very important issue for me, in that how do we define corporate social responsibility? What is corporate social responsibility? And I think the issue that he raised is that in our governments have failed to provide the infrastructure that they should provide, we now get into corporate social responsibility being misunderstood to provide those things that the government, not that I totally disagree. If they haven't done it, yes, well, if the organization can do it, why not? Particularly if that is what is most critical, the most critical need for that community at the time. But yes, it's important that we understand that it is not really the responsibility. It doesn't mean that that is good corporate social responsibility. Good corporate social responsibility should exist to support what is already being provided by the government, not to take over the responsibilities of the government. But we find that in our environment, sometimes we need to take over, because if you're doing something that really does where where the biggest needs are, then maybe it might be most understood. The other side for me about corporate social responsibility is in not only recording the activities of corporate social responsibility, but also in how we from corporate social responsibility. And I think those gains will, as Mr. Alex explained, is in social tickets, the social acceptance that the community has for the organization. I know that part of the argument that has been going around, going back to this Dangote issue, is Dangote is saying, look, we're one of the biggest employers, we're one of the biggest providers of this and that, and we're being more or less harassed by the government. Is this something that we can consider? Look, yes, indeed, Dangote does provide employment for so many people. they are across so many industries and all of that, does that then give them special positions in terms of how they're treated? I don't know. It's an open question for me. I think I'll stop there as well before I swim into very, very
dicey issue. Okay. Prof. Bankole.
Yeah, I think, like the other panelists have articulated, the government has failed in many respects. And so, what I advise for some companies when they're looking at CSR is to first identify what the needs are, the priorities, and then how this fits into their own culture, their own ethos as a company. Um, because some issues of maybe school education, some issues of maybe roads drainage, and so on and so forth. So identifying that, and then the next question will be, um, who are the stakeholders that you want to engage, because there are some communities have, I mean, experience with some clients. You want to do some things, and they tell you you have to pay them before you construct the road, you construct drainage, and it's like, why should we pay you to be able to do this? Even the local government insists on being paid before some things are done, which they have failed to do. And so perhaps um, companies may support engagements with stakeholders. So stakeholders can also call on governments to do more. In that way, the burden on companies in our part of the world will not be as heavy, because the Ogoni case situation that was mentioned earlier. I mean, um, if the government taxes on Shell had been used in Ogoni land properly, perhaps um, Shell would not have been under such pressure. But then um, all companies too should realize that you are trading in a particular place, and so you cannot be trading there and the place is an environmental disaster. I mean, drainage, roads, and so on and so forth, because people are going to question. I mean, is this company just about money? And like Mr. Alex said, I mean, some people would prefer companies that seem to empathize with the their communities. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. There's this new perspective on corporate governance, which has so much emphasis on environment now, which is the environmental sustainability policies and programs. Well, we're talking about everything you're doing, consider the environment and all the environmental friendly, this, that. Do you think this is something which will add more flavor to corporate governance among organizations in terms of corporate social responsibilities? And if even already existing areas of corporate governance had not been implemented by organizations, do you think they can actually do well with environmental sustainability? Ms. Opayiinka.
again, absolutely yes. It's a subject that we cannot run away from in our world today, and organizations will do well. In fact, you see a lot of organizations setting up particular specific desks to take care of environmental footprints and environmental responsibilities and all of that. And yes, we do have to take a look at that, because it's everybody's responsibility to ensure that the environment that we exist in is protected, is not ignored as we do our business. The example that Mr. Alex gave earlier on of Shell in the Ogoni land, and yes, and I like the way Prof dealt with it, to say that if the taxes from Shell had been used to protect the environment in Ogoniland, maybe we wouldn't have had as much of the problems that we had from that sector like we did. Basically, absolutely yes. It's an area that we all have to pay a lot of attention to, and it then means that we all have to school and educate ourselves into what our responsibilities are within our environment, in terms of protecting our environment, in terms of not destroying our environment, and how we can support excuse me, how we can support our environment in the production of our businesses. We need to have people who are trained to understand what our environmental footprints are and how we can make sure that we pay good attention to it. What I do not agree with, however, is for developed nations, and I use that in quotes, to put the responsibility of environmental footprints on developing nations in a way that they didn't have to deal with when they were developing, in a way that says we have as much of a yes, we do have as much of a responsibility as they do to protect our environment, but I think that the playing field is not level in terms of our contribution to the destruction of the environment, and that should be reflected in the global structures that are put around ESG and those goals that we need to attain going forward. I think it's important that we make it a fair playing field, basically, because some of those nations do a lot more damage than we do to the environment, and the goals and the structures should reflect that. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. Prof. Bankole, your perception on that, environmental sustainability goals.
Well, I mean, the reality is what Ms. Opayiinka has enumerated. Uh, we have enormous deposits of oil, gas, and solid minerals, for instance, in Nigeria. And then somebody tells us, oh, you cannot, well, you could do gas, but you cannot do oil. You cannot do this mineral, you cannot do that because of the environment. And meanwhile, if we are able to exploit this, it's going to give us more needed revenue. So there must be a balance. So I will not accept, even though I believe we must protect Mother Earth, that in protecting Mother Earth, we then just play by the rules that have been handed down to us by the West today. We need to look at our interests. For instance, something is emerging in the UK that some of the new findings in terms of their oil and gas, they're thinking of exploiting them, and that is bringing some concern to the rest of the world. But the question is, we need the funding which can come out of exploiting this. Why should we leave it and then go borrowing like we do in this part of the world? But the other part to it is that some of the acts that we may have to do if we want to take care of things in our environment may in the long run also make us run more efficiently, and maybe could also lead to some new businesses or business opportunities. And so I think there must be a lot of collaboration. As a teacher, I feel that African universities have need to close the gap in this area, because there is not much that we are doing in terms of bridging the gap with town and gown on issues of this nature. I remember some years back in my university in Babcock, we had issues with the environment and neighbors close to our law school, and the kind of gas that was being emitted was dangerous because of the kids that had asthma. And when I discussed with my colleagues in public safety, public environment, health and safety and so on, they said that, oh, we could actually do something about the gas and use it to power some of the things that we do on campus. And I said, oh, I think that would be, rather than taking them to court to stop them from running their business, if we are able to use the feces and so on from the poultry and so on, piggery and so on, that will place us on the record internationally as an exemplary institution, and then other people will copy that. So it's one of the things that we need to look at, because we can subdue the earth, subdue the problems around us. And in trying to subdue them, we'll find out that we're finding and creating solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. A follow-up question to you. Do you think universities across Nigeria, Africa have lived to the expectation of on innovation and corporate governance? That is basically.
Certainly we have not. Certainly we have not. And it starts from the culture. I mean, Siprenequency taught me that, and I'm sure I can ask Tolu and Alex this. I mean, your kids, your nephews and nieces, when you buy toys for them, they move and makes noise. And what do? They smash the toys on the floor, and they're inquisitive, and we smack them as Africans. Don't spoil that toy. You need to use the toys for your younger ones. But we are telling them not to ask questions. So that culture should change. We should ask questions. Without that, there can be innovation. Now, you cannot be doing innovation when the industry, you're not talking to industry. And so there is a very big gap in the universities in Africa. But I believe that if we look back, because, I mean, traditional knowledge of how our mothers and forefathers were able to deal with things, whether health-wise or even the roofing of mud houses, the preservation of food. There are things which we need to look back into now and try and see what we can do, because a lot of medicines, for instance, people come to Africa or some traditional societies, they find out how you deal with your ailments, and they extract the active ingredients, get a patent on it, and they then sell it to us, just like our oil, just like our chocolate. And that is one of the things, a major thing which universities should invest in, so that we can work more in terms of ideas and move them from ideas to the marketplace by linking with industry and getting funding and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Mr. Alex Goma, your perception on environmental sustainability goals.
Yeah, I think ESG goals are critical for, they're part of corporate governance. So, because one of the elements of corporate governance is around risk management. And I think it's critical for every business to always evaluate what is happening and therefore look at what are the risks involved here. And when it comes to the environment, the risk can be multifaceted, right? One is the impact of the environment, or as a result of that, are there changes in legislation, in laws that could affect sourcing of raw materials or costs to the business? So I think from a business perspective, it's important to look at that. The second is the impact of consumers. Okay, people getting to the point where, because of social awareness, they start to make choices of which product to buy because of the environmental footprint of that particular company. So I think it's critical for every company, the board, to review and look at that. And based on the assessment and the impact that you see on your business, you then define your goals. Your goals should not be defined for you from outside. I mean, you define your goals, but ensure that your goals are aligned with the direction that you see either regulation or the general community moving in that direction. Because sometimes to react requires certain capital investments. If you don't think about them in advance, and sometimes what is permissible becomes law, right? I use a simple example. In Rwanda, you can't use polythene bags. It's banned. It's not banned in Nigeria today, but what if the government wakes up today and decides that we're going to do that? How quickly do you adjust to get your packaging and things like that? So I feel that it's critical for businesses to look at these things, but then define your reaction based on your own context. And but be clear that if you don't deal with it, it's going to come and bite you sometime in the future.
Thank you. It's going to come and bite you sometime. We're rounding up. I want to hear your perception on issues that we need to put in place. That is, going forward, what do we need to put in place to make sure that we are not only enforcing corporate governance, but we're also looking at the enlightenment aspect of corporate governance among institutions, among government in terms of public sector and the private sector, even as well as the consumers, individual employees of organizations and all that. What should we look forward to? That is solutions to the problems that we face with corporate governance now. Ms. Opayiinka.
So, my rounding up comment around that would be we need to refocus our energies around capacity development in understanding all the different aspects of corporate social governance. It's important that we stop approaching it as something that we have to get through and approach it as something that supports the growth of our industries, the growth of our companies. We have a lot of developing small and medium sized companies in our environment that just need to have a better understanding of what corporate governance is and see corporate governance as a tool rather than a process that they just a box they have to tick and something they get punished for when they don't take it. I think that that's very critical. What do we need to do? Prof mentioned it earlier on. A lot of our regulators actually don't know enough about corporate governance themselves and therefore don't project it in the light that they need to. I think there's still a lot of education and capacity development that has to support that. Secondly, I think that we also need to celebrate good corporate governance when we do see it. We need to celebrate it, we need to project it so that others can learn from the benefits and the good returns that we get from good corporate governance. I think those are the critical areas that we need to look at. We need to also always document and put in place what the meaning of good corporate governance is, what the processes are for good corporate governance. And yes, our universities have to get involved to teach these subjects, to project these subjects, and make sure that we all go into the corporate world with a clear understanding of what that means to us and the benefits that it brings to us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Opayiinka. Sir Alex Goma.
Yeah, I think along similar lines, I think the focus should be on selling the benefits of corporate governance, right? How do we let people understand that the best way to drive sustainability of businesses is to ensure that they're well run properly? And if you have examples to show, we can do that. I think when people go to register companies, there could be a kind of checklist of things that provides a guidance. So whether it's a small company or whatever, these are certain basic frameworks you can use. It doesn't have to be mandatory or compulsory, but at least the people are exposed to that and they start to understand that this is what will make your business sustainable. And then we ensure that on the education side, I think these practices and best practices and also the rating systems are done in such a manner that the rating systems are very clear and transparent, not the multiple awards that people create to do business. Real, proper awards that are measured, clear, tangible. So you start to show the people who are doing the right things, and therefore you start to reward the right kind of behaviors. And maybe for some of the institutions as well, and maybe the regulators, if you provide certain kind of maybe rewards for people that do the right things, is it possible to give a tax rebate for the company, 0.1% or whatever? It's those kind of things that therefore people will start to see the benefit and therefore will try to do that. And then if you get that going, then we will start to see that apply across everywhere.
Thank you so much, sir. Prof. Bankole?
Well, if we're able to identify success stories, those who have done things, compliance, and because of compliance, you see improvements maybe in their bottom line or impact. We need to showcase this. But the last thing I'd like to say is the importance of engaging with the regulators, because sometimes when regulations are issued, they have some aims. Those aims are often drawn along the lines of what you've seen in some other parts of the world, which may not fully fit into the Nigerian or African system. And it behoves the industry, those who are regulated, to engage and see how we could fine-tune this and improve. Let me give you an example. When Mnet came into Nigeria in the early 90s, there was a broadcast code that said they must have, I think, 60% local content, which was not available then in terms of quality and so on. So the engagement with the Broadcasting Commission was, oh, why don't we do training and do this and so on. And over the years, you could see the remarkable improvement in the quality of the films. So it's something like that. And because the regulator could have said, no, you must have 60% of local content right from beginning. But because they engage with the regulator, the thinking of the regulators changed, even though there was a regulation, and that helped the industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think at this point in time, I would love to say thank you to all of us for joining this session. I had a very, very, very wonderful conversation, and it's so interesting to have you on board this Corporate Governance Global Summit. And with you, with your contributions, with what you've said, and looking at what we need to do, I think it's going to be a responsibility of every one of us, not only companies, but as experts, as industry experts, as educationalists, as businessmen, for all of us to put our hands together to support the implementation and we are not going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about enforcement, because enforcement will always push us to the wall, which will not bring the quality or the result we want. But we'll take the aspect of enlightenment so that we'll grow from there. And then we see how enforcement once a while comes in. So I think it's going to be a responsibility of all of us, not only the government or the private sector or the small businesses, but all of us together. We will champion the agenda of corporate governance globally, not only in Africa, because as you said, most of the things that are being passed down to us in Africa needs to be issues of engagement. And on that matter, especially on the issue of environmental sustainability goals, on the issue of corporate social responsibility, on the issue of succession planning, on the issue, all other issues that we need to tackle in terms of corporate. It should be issues of engagement and enlightenment. And on that note, thank you so much, Professor Bankole, Sodipo, SAN, for joining us. Thank you so much, Sir Alex Goma. Thank you so much, Mrs. Opayiinka. I really appreciate all of you for joining us today. I am John Kofi Annan. It was a privilege to be your host today and to be your moderator today. And funny enough, very fortunate for me, today is my birthday. And when I was given this assignment, I said, okay, it's something to celebrate with. Thank you so much.
Happy
Thank you very
birthday.
much.
Thank you, everyone.